Okay, appreciate very much you joining us again tonight as we get back to our study in the Proverbs. Appreciate your patience with this study. We've been away for a couple of weeks, but we are looking at the 30th chapter of the book of Proverbs. Our study, at least this run through Proverbs, is coming swiftly to an end, or relatively swiftly. It's been an enjoyable study for me, at least, a profitable study, to spend this time and to go back through the great lessons that this book teaches us. And as we think about the 30th chapter, we've noticed in previous studies this is a little different. This is an addendum, of an appendix, if you will, or the last great section of the book. Beginning in chapter 25, we saw the words, the Proverbs of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah collected. And then we find a couple of great and famous addendums that go, maybe three, that go with that section. And this is the first, in chapter 30, the words of Agur. Who was this Agur? Well, we're not sure. All we know about him is what's here. There's some who have tried to make this another name for Solomon for various reasons, but it just never did seem to make a lot of sense to me, and his words don't seem to really represent Solomon very well. So I suspect he's probably, again, one of those wise men. The words of the wise we find as an addendum to the first great section of the Proverbs. Reference made to the words of the wise, and again we find it here. I think in the words of words of Agur, and the words of Lemuel in the next chapter. So let's go back and remember briefly what we've read here. Agur is this king, perhaps not an Israelite king, but nevertheless a man who respects Jehovah. The Holy Spirit saw fit to preserve his words and include them here, and the message that God gave him was a message about humility, recognizing our own limitations. We don't know anything. Agur starts out by saying, I just am too stupid to be human. That is one modern speech translation puts it rather bluntly, but he said, I tell you this, all knowledge is in God, and from him we learn how to live. But the first step in being wise, and I guess this is a point of review, it's a great thing to remember. If we're looking for wisdom, we're going to have to recognize that we don't have it in ourselves. It all comes from God. And if we think we're wise and we've got all the answers, then we never will find wisdom. So with that in mind, we have some great lessons that we'll not go back and reteach. But he talks to us about the dangers of both poverty and riches, and he talks about an arrogant, foolish generation that curses their father, and that is wise in their own eyes and lofty in their own sight, and whose teeth are as swords. For just a minute you think you're watching the news yesterday instead of a 3,000-year-old book, but there's no new thing under the sun. He talks about the greed of the world and how foolish it is that there's some people who in life are just like a horse leech. Give is all they know to ask of the world. And he talks about these quatrains of lessons for marvelous things. Verse 18 of an eagle in the air, or a serpent on a rock, or the way of a ship in the sea, or the way of a man with a maid. And he talks about four unbearable things. He includes in that number a servant when he reigns, and a fool when he's full, an odious woman when she's married, and a handmaid that's heir to her mistress. Wisdom teaches us something. about life and teaches us about the things to avoid and things that are marvelous. And that brings us to the lesson tonight. We began, I think, this section last time we were together, but if you'll bear with me just a minute, we'll have a brief review and move forward. Beginning in verse 24, there are 4 things which are little upon the earth, and yet they are exceeding wise. Let me clue you in. I guess we can include that. Now we have it on the chart. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. The conies are but a feeble folk, and yet they make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, and yet they go forth all of them in bands. The spider takes hold with her hands and is in kings' palaces. So here are 4 things small but wise. And when you look at them, what I think we see is we see lessons that God teaches in nature. A fellow made this point one time, and I knew he was talking to me, even if he didn't know it. He said, you know, we can be so impressed with what men make. And we can look at the buildings, and we can look, oh, look at this machine, or look at whatever it might be. But wise people have always looked at nature. And there's a great deal that nature has to teach us. And if you grew up in the country, you're probably miles ahead of somebody like me that grew up in the suburbs and probably hadn't spent near enough time just looking at what God has created. And the wise man here says, if you want to be wise, then learn from these little things. And all of the things that he talks about are little in the sense that they're, you know, you could crush them with your hand, powerless things compared to so many other creatures. And yet they're wise. Now, he's using that term wise accommodatively. Obviously, it's not an IQ issue here. But really what we're talking about in many cases is instinct. We're talking about that capacity that God has given. It may be transmitted chemically, you know, whatever, but somehow an ant accomplishes great things. He says here the ants are a people not strong, and yet they prepare their meat in the summer. Actually, we've seen earlier in the Proverbs, I think it's chapter 6, where the ants were also singled out there as being those we can learn from. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, and consider her ways. Be wise. Don't have a guide or an overseer, yet they provide meat in the summer and gather food in the harvest. And then he asked the question, how long will you sleep and slumber, you sluggard? The ant is productive, busy. And in our passage here in Proverbs 30, again, the ants are a people not strong, and yet look at all they can accomplish. I may have mentioned this already, but I don't think I ever had one. But I can remember being advertised when I was a boy, ant farms. I don't know if they still sell those or not. But it was a means by which you could put some ants in a clear container, and you could be able to watch them work and make tunnels and just marvel at how they interacted and so on. Well, in a lot of ways, that's what he's talking about here. Isn't it amazing what a little ant, you could crush a number of them under your foot, and yet look at all they accomplish. Everybody in their place, everybody working, everybody productive, everybody filling their role. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And when human beings who've been gifted with a great deal more insight and understanding and capacity to know, when they learn the lesson from the ant, just the ability, everybody to put their shoulder to the load and do their work, it's amazing what can be accomplished. It's amazing what can be avoided. Not a political program or political statement here. I tell you what, you know, we've got a lot of problems in this world that we have absolutely created for ourselves. You know, there's just so much poverty and suffering that goes on that is directly related to people who are not willing to work, who have no foresight, who are not willing to prepare. Some people suffer through no fault of their own. There are a lot of children in the world who suffer, not through the fault of their own, but the fault of the folks that ought to be looking out for them. And I'll tell you, if human beings have the sense that God gave an ant, we could do so much more to prepare for ourselves and to help those who cannot help themselves. It's just amazing how we failed to learn the lessons of wisdom. And folks a lot smarter than I am know that's so. There's so much suffering in this world that could be avoided if people simply were wise in the choices that they made. He talks in the next part about the about the conies. Now the coney he's talking about here, maybe your translation says something like rock badger. I think we've probably all seen these little critters like this. We've seen them on nature shows. They are a rather timid breed. And they're timid because they got good reason to be timid. They're not terribly strong. These are not badgers. These are not, there's some creatures that are small and ferocious. That's not who he's talking about here. This is a creature that would be pretty easy prey. Eagles, for example, and birds of prey, these raptors, they'll be going over an area and they'll see some prairie dog-like critter out here, swoop down and get them, take them off. But what these creatures do is they recognize their vulnerability. And so usually they'll have one of them that'll be on guard while the rest of them are eating, gathering food, whatever they're doing. They'll have one there to sound the alarm. It's amazing how they know how to do that. Well, they don't know how to do it except the instinct that God gave them for self-preservation. Anyway, these creatures live in rocks. That's where they make their dens, in the piles of rocks. Why? Because they're not strong enough to fight off the predators that are after them. And so they need a place that's secure. So what's the lesson he's trying to teach us here? He's trying to teach us, I think, not to feel invulnerable. Not to think of ourselves as being somehow above the danger. The world's a dangerous place in a lot of ways. And if you're not watching out, if you're not careful, you're going to get hurt. We're reminded every day of that, how true that is. In so many ways, that's true. And so what he commends to us is to have more of the carefulness that even these little critters, these little rock badgers would have. To be cautious. I think about their houses being in the rocks, and maybe you're like me, I can't help but think about that old song that we sing, then to the rock let me fly, to the rock that is higher than I. That song is based on another part of the wisdom literature, on the Psalms. In Psalm 61, it's a Psalm of David. And Psalm 61 begins with these words, "Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a shelter for me and a strong tower from mine enemy." In life, David said, I've figured out I'm not big enough. I'm not strong enough. I go to the rock that is higher than I. I look for that strong tower, that fortress in this world, that's God. If you have the wisdom of a rock badger, you know you don't lean on your own strength. What does that mean? It means in a practical sense every day we ought to start with prayer. Haven't we lived long enough to know this lesson? I have no idea what today's going to bring. If we have tomorrow, I have no idea what tomorrow's going to bring. Sometimes surprise is good, sometimes surprise is not pleasant. And so what do? We say, Lord, help me through it. I'm leaning on you. I need your help. You've not promised me that I would have a life free from trouble and loss, but in whatever it is that I face, help me to be wise. Help me to have faith. Help me to lean on Thee. Help me to be filled with a proper perspective. And I think if we'll have that kind of prayer on our lips every day, through the day, will be much harder to push over, to get off balance, or like these little critters here, much more difficult for the enemy to come and take us off, because we realize that we need the rock that is higher than ourselves. In this same setting here, he talks about the locusts. He said they have no king, and yet they go forth, all of them, by bands. It is amazing, isn't it, what locusts can do? And yet again, locusts don't have a king, but it seems like somehow they all work in concert. I appreciate the point Brother made years ago. He said, we got folks who are sitting around saying, well, I just don't know what to do. Nobody will tell me what to do. You ought not have to be told what to do. God has told us what to do. Find a place to work and get busy. That's the lesson I think that God would teach us. The locust knows. He doesn't need somebody to tell him. God gave him the wisdom. And the same is true with us. We've got the Word. We're not waiting for somebody to have to pick us up and carry us to work. Be like the locust there. Be about what God has given you to do without having to be driven by some individual, as the case might be. Everybody working for the good of the whole. Everybody working toward the common purpose. That's a lesson the locust can teach. Let me mention another example that he gives here. In my Bible, verse 28, the spider takes hold with her hands and is in king's palaces. The King James uses the word spider. I think of, when I read this passage, I think about something that happened to my wife and I years ago. I hadn't been married very long, and we went down to Orlando, Florida. My mother had a sister that lived in the area there, and she was gracious enough, my wife and I, to go and stay with her. We were going to go to Disney World back when things were much different. I can't remember, she probably would. I think we bought a 2-day pass, and I think we might have paid, I don't know, did we pay $40 for it? Surely it's more than that. It wasn't much more than that. Anyway, different world. But we went down there and we stayed with my aunt, and she may have mentioned to us, it seemed like she did, something about how that there were a few spiders around the house. Maybe we had seen one earlier in the evening. But she encouraged us not to kill them because they took care of the other bugs. Now my Aunt Helen was a very clean person and a very good housekeeper. But you live in some parts of the world and you're just going to have insects. And it's a constant fight. And the spiders were welcome because they helped in that fight. The problem was, of course, to my wife, the spiders were just another bug. And so one night we were heading to bed, and my wife said there was a huge spider in the bathroom. Anyway, not to be in any way disrespectful, but she was noted to be on the exaggerating side when it came to insects. They always looked mighty big, and so I grabbed up a shoe, as I recall, and I went into the bathroom. I asked her where it was last time she saw it, and she said it was on the back of the Kleenex box, I think it was. And I didn't see it at first, and then a leg came back around that box. And I thought, man, I need a bigger shoe or a gun or something. That was a big spider. It really was. And I have to tell you, I'll skip through a lot of details there. We actually wound up killing it. I thought it was self-defense, but we just decided we wouldn't tell Aunt Helen about that one. But he'd been eating a lot of bugs apparently. But anyway, I think about how that creatures like that do have a place. Now, your translation may use an entirely different term. Lizard may be the term that's used. I think the ESV and others use that. The Hebrew word's a little bit vague. It carries with it the idea of to stun, to numb, the idea of a creature that injects a poison that stuns its prey, and that could be a spider. It would fit that. It could be also a lizard. It could be a number of other things. I knew a fellow who went over to India, and he was over there, and he stayed in a really nice hotel in one of the big cities there. And his family was horrified by the fact that he had young daughters at the time. There were lizards in the hotel there. And he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "they love lizards over here because they eat the other bugs." As he used to point out, even lizards live in good hotels. Even spiders live in king's palaces. What's the lesson? The lesson, I think, is that it's remarkable how far we can go if we simply can provide a useful, helpful service to others. There's always room for that. And it's remarkable how so many people who just set out to do something that helps their fellow man, how far they can go and how much they can be appreciated by people because of the service they provide. Wisdom teaches that. Just make it your habit to serve other people. You're not looking to be ambitious in some carnal way, and yet there's no telling how far you can go. So little things, and yet all of these have a place and can bring great blessings. And then in chapter 30, verse 29, he has another group of four. He says there are three things that go well, yea, four that are comely and they're going. And so here are four comely things, four stately things. A lion, which is strongest among the beasts and turns not away for any, and a greyhound, and a he-goat also, and a king against whom there is no rising up. So here's another set of four, and a very different set of four. We've seen a lot of creatures that are despicable, and we've seen some that are weak and yet useful, and here we see some who are riding on the high side. Though they're very different, they all have a certain dignity about them. They're comely things. They're things that are impressive to watch as they walk, as the Good News Bible paraphrases it. Magnificent when they move. And of course he talks about the lion. Here's the king of beasts, and the lion is magnificent in his nature. The Lord made all kind of creatures, but he made some lions, and he gave them a dignity that is hard to miss there. And the Lord made greyhounds as well. That's the word of the King James Version. Actually, the term greyhound is translated greyhound. Two Hebrew words here, I'm told. And the literal definition, one of them is the word for tight knit, and the other is the word for waist. And so, literally, the idea is of well knit, well gird. And that would fit a greyhound. A greyhound is made for one thing, and that's speed. And when it runs, it just is not quite like anything else. Other translations, though, offer a different rendering of this. You can tell there's some room for question in the language here, and some use a war horse. I think the Bible in basic English uses a war horse has a magnificence. To watch a horse as it walks, as it runs, it has a gait that, again, it's just a God-given glory. But you know, it's interesting. I think the contemporary English version, some of the translations, talk about this word and translate it as a strutting rooster. You know, even a rooster has, you know, we talk about, you know, the idea of strutting. I guess that word probably applies more to the rooster than anything else. We apply it to people as well. But it has its own sort of magnificence to it. These are all creatures that God made that move in a way that's unforgettable. And then he talks about the he-goat. And he says that, you know, he mentions this term of the he-goat. He-goat likewise, as it would lead at the head of its flock. John Wesley in his commentary writes, the he-goat marches in the head of the flock in a grave and stately manner, conducting them with great courage and resolution, and being ready to fight for them, either with beasts or with men that oppose him. There's a great dignity there. And then all of that leads to the idea of a king. Here's a human being. But this king now, at the head of his army, or as some of the translations offer, at the head of a nation in which no army can challenge. And here is a king in all of his glory as he moves before his people to shouts of acclamation and so on. So, you know, what are all these images of the lion and the goat or the horse or the king? What is all that trying to teach us? Well, I think it says something about the fact that God in his power has granted a dignity to his creatures. When you go back to the book of Job and you look at the speech that God made with Job, it's interesting how, you know, God impresses his greatness by just pointing to his creation. And he says, who taught the eagle to fly? Did you do that, Job? And where were you when I made the inanimate creation? But where were you likewise when I made all of these magnificent creatures? All of these creatures have a dignity that God gave them. And I think there's another lesson inherent in that. Not only does it bring honor to God, but it also encourages us to be proud of who we are. Now that principle can be abused. We ought not to ever be proud of sin. God didn't make us to sin. He didn't make us to be rebels. He didn't make us to indulge and abuse one another or to be ruled by lust. There's some people who seem to be proud of that. There's no room for that. But you know, God made all kinds of creatures. And in things that are lawful and right and proper, we ought to take a pleasure in the way God made us. And I think all of these creatures likewise are creatures that exhibit a certain leadership quality. You know, the cock of the walk, you know, the rooster sort of patrols his territory, and the lion likewise, and the king likewise. And every one of us as human beings, we have our place. And within the realm of what is lawful and right, we ought to take great pleasure in that. And just rejoice in what God has given us to do. To carry ourselves with a certain dignity. I can't remember the whole of the story, and I can't remember where I read it, so you'll have to forgive me. But somehow the punchline stuck with me. There was a fellow that some of his folks he worked with, you know, were sort of belittling of him because he didn't wallow with the rest of the guys, you know, and sort of the low behavior that they involve themselves in. The drinking and the dirty jokes and the things of that nature. And one fellow thought he was insulting him. He said, you know, man, you act like you're a king the way you act sometimes. And this man who was a Christian responded by saying, I am a king, made so by God, and a priest. And he said, I think I ought to carry myself with the dignity of a king and a priest. And if we can raise our children to have that kind of spirit, not a haughty spirit, but a spirit, dignity is a good word, a dignity within themselves. They're just some things that are just, it's unworthy of them. There's some avenues or some, it's not worthy. I've been blessed by God, and I'm not going down that road. I'm not going to lower myself like that. We would do well if we had some of that. And I think that's what these illustrations probably point to. Now, let me close with the last section of this book. And I think it's to sort of rein us in with the point he's just made. He's been talking about things that are comely. But now he wants to warn us about an undue pride. And we find in verses 32 and 33 this final exhortation. He says, if thou hast done foolishly in lifting up thyself, or if thou hast thought evil, lay thy hand upon thy mouth. Surely the churning of milk brings forth butter, and the wringing of the nose brings forth blood, and the forcing of wrath brings forth strife. So what does that have to do? This is sort of the last word from Agur. And I think it's based upon his lesson on the dangers of human pride and our necessity to lean upon God. So he closes, I think, with an admonition. We might paraphrase it, just saying, don't allow yourself to become too full of yourself. If you've done foolishly in lifting up thyself, or if thou hast thought evil, if you're going to lift yourself up, and there are certainly people who become proud, bragging, maybe your translation says arrogant. Arrogance, really, that's really what it is. It's just a false, improper sense of our own greatness. We think of ourselves as above others. Now, this term, thought evil, goes back to the idea of evil plans, but it seems to be tied again to pride. And the idea is, don't allow yourself to be so proud that you then feel justified in taking an ungodly course toward your fellow man, toward your brother, toward your wife, toward your parents, whatever it might be. Don't let that pride lift you up and, as it were, cause you to feel good about throwing off restraint. And you just might as well say it as think it. Just tell him what you think and just let it flow. Let that anger. Oh my, don't do that. That's advice straight from the devil. Here's what he said. He taught that lesson in a way that he wants me to remember, and it's hard to forget. He said in verse 33, the churning of milk brings forth butter, and the wringing of the nose brings forth blood, and the forcing of wrath brings forth strife. And I'm sure you've noticed this before, heard this in lessons before, that you have these three pictures here. The churning of milk and the wringing of the nose. Now, churning and wringing are both the same word. It's the idea of a forcing, of just continuing again and again and again. And we know that if you act on milk in a certain way, this is what the result's going to be. And you also know, if you grab somebody's nose and keep twisting it, eventually, what's going to happen? Not going to be a pleasant result for that fellow's nose, I'll tell you. And it's the same word in the last part of the verse, the forcing, wringing, churning. All the same word in Hebrew. And it's all this idea of a fellow who will not quit, who continues on and on and on. You know where this leads. And the lesson he's teaching is, forcing wrath brings forth strife. If you just keep on and keep on, so filled with yourself, so lifted up, so important in your own eyes, the result ultimately is that you're going to make a bad situation worse. So what does he say? He says, lay your hand upon your mouth. It could be that we could apply that this way. If you're thinking about saying something arrogant and divisive and hateful, put your hand on your mouth. Or it could be that if you have begun, if you've already said something too much, put your hand on your mouth. Let me tell you what we ought never to do. As I said earlier, well, might as well just say it as think it. No. There's some things you ought not think. There's things I ought not to even entertain in my mind, much less say them. And if I catch myself, maybe in a situation where you're talking to your wife, and you're angry and you're lifted up and proud and arrogant, you think you're right about this matter, and that's all that counts. You know, I can be right about a matter and still be wrong in the way I point it out and the way I deal with it. I might be right about the issue and make a gigantic mess of things. So the wise man is saying that if you catch yourself in a situation where you've already spoken angrily and unnecessarily, unfriendly, hateful way, don't just keep going. Turn around. And better yet, don't go down that road at all, because you know where it leads. Arrogance will put us in all kind of problems. One fellow wrote, the irritation and provocation of anger occasions quarrels and contentions. And this was the part that stuck with me. He said, anger is like a stone cast into a wasp's nest. The verse must be taken in connection with the preceding as enforcing the duty of self-restraint and silence under certain circumstances. Well, I've got this rock in my hand. I might as well throw it at that hornet's nest. I don't follow the logic there. Well, I poured gasoline all over my house. I might as well throw a match on it. No, don't do that. Don't do that. If we're heading down the wrong road, the thing we can do is stop right there and turn around. And the sooner the better. Don't let pride cause you to continue. How many people do you think you know? How many folks that, let me just ask it this way, how many times have we found ourselves continuing down a road we knew was not the right way to go? We know we had spoken unkindly, but instead of backing up and apologizing immediately, we just going to keep on keeping on. That's the devil. That is the devil. And so a wise man will recognize that. And if he's having trouble today, he may just say, I am really irritable today. I'm sorry. I'm trying to work on it. Please be patient with me. And if I'm quiet for a while, that's why. It's not your fault, my fault. Or if it is your fault, it sure ain't worth all this. It's more my fault than yours because I'm angry when I shouldn't be. That's what wise people do. They recognize the problem, they work on it, and back up. And the fool, he just lets it fly to his own destruction and to all kinds of problems he causes for those around him. So it's a great lesson. Agor's lesson in Proverbs 30 is a great lesson. And the sooner I get this all applied every day in my life, the better my life will be. Okay, I think we'll stop there. And we'll try, Lord willing, next week to move into Proverbs 31. I'm sure we'll be able to do that. And we'll be looking at the last two great lessons that we find in that chapter, which include the words of Lemuel that his mother taught him, and then this marvelous, famous acrostic poem, really, about the glory of the virtuous woman. But I do very much appreciate you joining us this week, and we hope that you'll be blessed this week. Pray for one another, and may the Lord help us to always be faithful